Hey YouTubers, welcome back to Desert Have a Garden. I have to confess that I have been so busy with regular day-to-day life and the garden and the homestead that I have not made any sourdough videos in a long time. So I definitely owe you one. Today I want to give you a really simple sourdough recipe for making cheese bread. So cheese bread is something that's super delicious, but using your bread machine can actually be really simple and it will be ready just in time for dinner and you can really enjoy that. So what we'll do is we'll start out with our basic sourdough bread recipe and then we'll toss in some cheese at the end, shape our loaves, and then we will have a delicious treat. So let's get started by going over the ingredients list to get started. So back here I have 4 cups of flour. So this is just a regular white flour that I like to use. If you use whole wheat flour, you are going to get a denser loaf. And so it won't be as soft and fluffy. It's your choice. Some people prefer that. I prefer to use the whole wheat on more of an artesian loaf, but not so much for this. We definitely have our starter, so you can see that this starter is nice and reactive, it's bubbly, it's happy. So we are going to use 2 cups of starter. And this is for a double loaf of bread. So when I'm baking and I'm going to turn on that oven in the summertime and heat up my kitchen, I'm definitely doing a double batch. So I'll have 2 loaves of bread with this recipe. You can very simply cut it in half if you only want to make 1 loaf, but you know what? You make lots of friends when you bake extra bread. We will be using salt. I like to use real salt, 2 teaspoons. We'll use just a little bit of a sweetener, so I will be using coconut sugar, 1 tablespoon, but you can use just regular sugar if you'd like. If you use honey, it adds moisture and it will make your loaf a little bit denser. And then at the very end, we will stir in cheese. You'll need 2 cups of shredded cheese. I prefer to use cheddar, and so that's what I will be using for this recipe. But let's get started mixing all of our ingredients together. The first thing you need is the bread pan out of the bread machine, and you want to make sure that you install the paddle into the bread pan before adding any ingredients, because it is really disappointing when you have this full of all of your ingredients and realize you have nothing to mix it with and you have to dump everything out and start over again. So it's really important to make sure that paddle is in there. And we will get started with adding our dry ingredients first. So in goes our 4 cups of flour. Next we will put in our salt. 2 teaspoons. You can even add more salt if you prefer a saltier loaf, but because this has cheese in it, it should be just about right. Then we will put in 1 tablespoon of sugar, and this is the coconut sugar. You can use regular sugar or another sweetener if you like. This just tames down the sourness of the bread. You can omit it altogether if you prefer a more sour loaf. If you do use honey, it adds moisture to the bread and it will make your loaf denser. Next are the wet ingredients, 1 cup of water. So this could be anywhere from 3/4 to 1 3/4 cups of water, depending on how dry it is where you are and depending on what types of flour you use. And then comes the star of the show, our starter. So you can see that this starter is happy, it's bubbly, it's full of life, and it is ready to be used. This was just fed yesterday morning, and so now after I use it, I will feed it the remainder and put it back in the fridge. And before using that, you give it a good mix up and you see how sticky it is and stretchy. That is a good indicator of a healthy starter, and it has a nice, slightly sour scent to it. And this doesn't have to be exact. There's 1 cup. And 2 cups. Now we don't add our cheese just yet. We will add that after the first rise. Let's get it into our bread machine. You can see all the ingredients inside the bread pan. We place it in the machine and lock it into place. Give it a tug to make sure that it's locked in there. And we'll close the lid to prevent any splashing out. And the next thing is to set the machine. So I use menu number 8 for dough. And then you simply press start. And then it starts mixing. I will show you a peek of the inside as it just gets started here. And I'll check back with you in a minute as it is incorporating. As the dough begins to form a ball, it looks a little bit dry, but you have to give it a little bit more time. You want to make sure you allow it to fully incorporate before you start adjusting your recipe. It has been a couple more minutes of mixing, and you can see that the dough is starting to form into a nice ball now without adding any water. The machine has completed the cycle for the dough, and you can see that it is nice and spongy, well hydrated, but not too sticky. So while the machine is nice and warm, we'll allow this to close up and warm and rise. I allow it to rise for 2 hours. That doesn't have to be exactly precise. You can go as short as 1 hour, you can go as much as 3 hours, but the second rise will be longer, and you want a total rising time of at least 8 hours so that that sourdough can really process through the grains there. So I will check back with you in a couple hours. The bread has been rising for 2 hours now, and you can see it has risen quite a bit. Today's a really dry day, so it actually formed a bit of a dry crust on it, which is not highly desirable. However, it is going to be kneaded once again, so it's not a huge concern. Over here I have 2 cups of cheddar cheese shredded and ready to go in. Mine is white cheddar cheese. You can use white or yellow. Yellow kind of gives that appealing color variation. However, the orange cheese has no difference in flavor. It just simply has a coloring added to it. So over here on our machine, we're going to see it's reached 0. It does that after 1 hour of the dough setting. So now I'm going to turn it off and turn it back on again so it starts up the kneading process. And at this time I will add in the cheese in order to allow that to incorporate into the dough. The cheese is getting mixed in nicely, and you can see that it's a nice smooth dough. I'm really happy with this consistency. It's not too sticky, but it's still really soft. After it's incorporated really nicely, the cheese is mixed in all throughout, then we are going to turn it out onto the counter and begin shaping our loaves. I have taken the bread pan out of the bread machine, and now we're going to turn it out onto our surface in order to prepare it for the pans. It is sticky enough that it'll stick to the surface, so you want to lightly dust with some flour. And also put some flour on your hands in order to prevent sticking to your hands. So out it goes. Sometimes the paddle from the bread pan comes out with it. This time it did not, so the paddle is still in there. Set that aside. And this is 2 loaves worth. And if you have a pastry cutter, this is a good time to use it. I don't have one, so I'm just using a spatula, or you can use the old hand wringing method where you just kind of separate it by hands. So I'll put one off to the side over here. And this one here we are going to shape up into our loaf. So first, spreading it out, kind of flattening it. And the cheese is already inside the dough here. I'm going to fold it up into thirds and then seal it back down. This gives it lots of nice layers for it to rise in. And then I'm going to roll it over and continue sealing it, pressing it and rolling it over. And now it's all rolled up. You see there's a seam there. Because this is a cheese loaf, I'm thinking I'm going to add a topper to it. That sounds really good. Here is everything but the bagel seasoning. So it has sesame seeds, poppy seeds, garlic, onion, and salt. And that sounds really tasty to me. So I'm going to kind of press that into the loaf. And then it'll have a nice little crust on it. It's not as sticky on that side. I'll kind of roll it into the seasoning there. Maybe a little more over here. Okay. And then I'm placing these in my stoneware pans. These are bread pans. And this will go right in here. I like the stoneware because it gives the crust a nice crispness and it bakes really evenly. Now I will prepare the next loaf. Okay, finally, I will cover them in plastic wrap. This keeps the moisture in and will prevent that crust forming on the dough. You don't want that hard crust forming on the outer dough here. If you were not going to put a topper on these and they were still pretty sticky, you could certainly add a little bit of butter or oil to the top of the loaf in order to keep the plastic from sticking. But now, because this is sourdough, we are going to allow it to rise for quite some time. I'm going to allow these to rise probably 6 hours. They're not as reactive as commercial yeast, so they won't be bursting out of the pan at that time, but we'll give them some time to puff up and we will check back in about 6 hours. The loaves have been rising for 6 hours now, and as you can see, they are not as reactive as a commercial yeast bread. They did not come up over the sides of the pan at all. So they don't rise substantially, but they have risen somewhat. And I have preheated the oven to 350 degrees to begin baking them. And I'm going to score the loaves in order to give them predetermined lines to rise upon. And you can use a sharp knife to do this, or you can also use a razor blade. You just want something to be very sharp. So this knife doesn't look all that sharp. So I scored down in one direction, and then I come back across in the opposite direction, making an X. And what this does is it helps prevent the loaf from splitting on the side. This allows it to rise where you have marked it. Okay, so now they're both scored. I don't know that this one got deep enough over here. Because this isn't sharp enough, I'm kind of sawing it a little bit. But now they will go into the oven and bake. It can take anywhere from 30 to 50 minutes. I find that with my oven, it's typically 35 minutes for these loaves to completely bake through. So we'll check back in a little bit. It has been 35 minutes of baking, and I'm going to give 5 more minutes of baking for these. I'd like to see them golden up a little bit more and sound a little bit more hollow. I'll check back in 5 minutes. The loaves baked for a total of 40 minutes, and I took them out and put them on this cooling rack to allow them to cool until I could handle the pans. Stoneware pans retain their heat for quite some time, and that's how it gives it the nice crust around the edges. So I will separate these out. You can see how nice that loaf looks. I would have liked to have scoured through here a little bit deeper, or scored it a little bit deeper, in order to have more distinct X's on there. So the next time I would definitely do that. And same with this one, but this is a really pretty loaf, and you can see that it rose quite nicely, but it did split a little bit on the side, not too much. If it had been scored a little deeper, it probably wouldn't have split at all. So I'm going to cut into these loaves and see what they look like on the inside. Let's cut into this cheese loaf. I use a serrated bread knife. And there we have it. Here's the end. It has nice air holes in it. It's fluffy and light. And I will get a taste tester and we will give this a try. First I'll put a little bit of butter on it. Bread is always better with butter. All right, we'll give this a try. Alrighty, we have our taste tester and we're going to try our cheese bread, see what it tastes like. Can you turn around it for the camera?
That tastes so good.
Oh yeah? I think the next time I would roll the cheese up in the bread so there would be distinct layers of cheese rather than mixed completely in. But overall the flavor's really good, and it's nice with the extra topper on it with the garlic and onion. Overall,
and butter.
And butter. I think it's a win. What do you think? Yeah? If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more updates in the future.